All right, even though the SEC, much of the SEC has decided to take basically a bye week in playing scrimmages against the likes of Western Carolina and Samford, still a nice and very important week around the nation with Week 13 of college football coming up starting on Thursday night. We bring in Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. Hey, Joe, how are you?
I'm doing great, Mark. Week number 12 was an interesting weekend of college football, amazing upsets. Week number 13 shaping up to be a solid week as well.
Okay, as we wind down the season, the last few weeks I've focused on those games that impact, obviously, the college football playoffs and also conference championships. So we start on Thursday night, and somebody might say West Virginia, Kansas State, both out of it. But Kansas State at 5-1 can still get to a Big 12 championship situation, or at least a share of the championship if they can get some help elsewhere. Kansas State's 5-1 in the conference. They go to Morgantown, where the Mountaineers were playing very well just a few weeks ago, but have hit a rough stretch here, Joe. So your thoughts about West Virginia hosting Kansas State in a pretty good Thursday night showdown?
It's a very good showdown, and I'm very interested to see how it plays out, but I really like Kansas State in this matchup for a few factors. First of all, they've owned the last two meetings, Mark, by an average margin of victory, 35 points per game. You look at this West Virginia team, high-octane offense, Clint Trickett throwing for over 3,000 yards. He's got a big play wide receiver in Kevin White. But this team is living dangerously. They're minus 13 in turnover margin. That's 120th overall in the country out of 125 teams. But more importantly, they're creating those turnovers at home. They're minus 12 in turnover margin in Morgantown. You look at their rushing defense, giving up about 180 rushing yards per game. And you look at Kansas State, they're plus 5 in turnover margin, have a solid offense and defensive lines. They're disciplined, do not create a lot of penalties. And when you look at West Virginia overall, Mark, I think you're starting to see the effects of the Big 12 schedule. No longer is West Virginia traveling to Boston College, traveling to Virginia Tech for these close away games. We saw it a few years ago with Geno Smith and the Mountaineers, where they jumped out to a 6-0 record and then dropped 6 straight games where they had to win a game against Iowa State at the end of the year just to become bowl eligible. You're starting to see where they have to go to Oklahoma, go to Texas, and I think you're seeing the residual effects of playing in the Big 12. I think this team has lived dangerously all season long, and I like Kansas State to really dominate on the road on Thursday night. I think they get about a 2-touchdown victory against Clint Trickett. When you look at the defensively for Kansas State, they struggle with the mobility of Trev Boykin. Clint Trickett, though, more a pocket passer. You know where he's going to be, and that offensive line for West Virginia has surrendered 24 sacks on the year. I think it's a dominant defensive effort as well for K-State.
Yeah, one of the better Thursday night matchups we've seen, and although the college football playoff rankings out the door for Kansas State at 2 losses right now at 7-2, still looking to share a conference championship in the Big 12. All right, let's turn our attention toward the Pac-12 because, again, although we would assume that Oregon gets by Colorado this week, there's a lot going on in the South. Let's first hit on that Ducks game hosting Colorado. Yes, the Buffs are 0-7. This should not be much of a game, but still, got to credit Colorado for playing a lot of teams within 1 to 2 scores in the Pac-12. They're an improving program. Still would appear to be no match for the Ducks, who still are staving off Florida State despite an undefeated Florida State team. Oregon still at number 2 in the nation.
I don't see any way Oregon loses this matchup. The only way is if they lose the turnover battle on Saturday tremendously to Colorado. I think their offense is explosive, but credit the Buffaloes. They pushed Brett Hundley and UCLA to the wire in overtime in Boulder this year, so anything's possible, but I still think there's too much offense with Marcus Mariota. They've seemed to solve those offensive line issues that hurt them against Arizona, where Mariota was sacked 5 times. The offensive line has played very well over the last 3 games, and defensively they've been able to get pressure on opposing quarterbacks. I think this is a very difficult matchup for Colorado, and I don't see any way Oregon doesn't win this game by at least 3 touchdowns.
Okay, the Pac-12 South. This is crazy, Joe. USC 6-2, UCLA, Arizona, Arizona State are all 5-2. So we've got basically a four-way tie for first place right now, and we've got a classic matchup, one of the best rivalries in college football, at the Rose Bowl with UCLA, now up to number 9 in the college football rankings. Probably don't have a shot, but think if they would beat USC and Stanford, then go to a championship game, defeat Oregon, and if chaos ensues elsewhere, it's not out of the realm of possibility. But just looking to get to the Pac-12 championship game at this point, the Bruins hosting their old rival USC.
Very interesting that the committee put UCLA at number 9, Mark. I was shocked by that. I really thought Georgia would have that spot based off their dominating performance over Auburn. When you look at UCLA, dropped back-to-back home games this year to Utah and then Oregon. They were really getting blown out by the Ducks before they had some late fourth quarter scores to make it a 12-point ball game. But they've seemed to right the ship in that victory at home against Arizona. But offensive line issues still hounding this team. Brett Hundley and those quarterbacks have been sacked 30 times in 10 games. When you look at USC in this matchup, +9 in turnover margin, they're able to create sacks, and you look at the UCLA defense, only 16 sacks on the year. I think if USC can protect Cody Kessler, who's having a fantastic season, I think USC wins this ballgame. They have a dominant offensive line. You look at Javorius Allen having a solid season, over 1,000 yards already, and Aguilar, what he's able to do in terms of stretching defenses. When you look at that offensive output against California on Thursday night last week, a dominating performance in my opinion, and Cal got some late scores to make it close. But if you're asking me who the more complete team is at this point in the season, I think it is USC, and they're opportunistic on defense. I think they push UCLA to the limit and get the victory on the road on Saturday.
Yeah, I think it's going to be the best game of the week, USC-UCLA. Really want to see that one. I think we've seen it a number of times with USC where the talent on the first string of the depth chart is there. They wear down at the end of games. They have issues on special teams and with some depth there. They almost lost one to Arizona that they had well in hand. Cal, you mentioned last week, up 31-2, almost blew that one, had an onside kick opportunity for the Golden Bears late, and of course Arizona State, they had that one is seemingly salted away and lost on the Hail Mary. USC, UCLA, both at 2 losses in the Pac-12 South, vying for a championship. Well, Arizona State having whipped up and coming off a big win a couple weeks earlier over USC on the aforementioned Hail Mary. We're primed to make a stab at getting after Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game and possibly making a bid for the college football playoff. And then they met Sean Mannion and company late last Saturday night, got upset on the road after having a 10-point lead in the second half, tried to get back at it, put the goal back in sight to win a Pac-12 championship game because it's right there for them, hosting Washington State.
Very interesting matchup because Washington State playing very well over the last few games. And you look at this Arizona State team. Arizona State, very, very disappointing loss that really dropped their playoff hopes last week. I thought it would be a tough matchup for Arizona State for a couple of factors because their last 3 games, Mark, you look at 4 weeks ago, they played against Washington in Taylor Kelly's first game back on the road. Difficult place to play. He looked lackluster through 3 quarters. The defense came around in the 4th quarter to give them a dominating victory by double digits. They came back home and got pushed to the limit against a blue-collar Utah team that they won in overtime, and then had to play a solid Notre Dame team where they jumped up 34-3 and expended a lot of energy because Notre Dame cut it to 34-31 before they had to pull away in the 4th quarter, and then they had to go on the road to Corvallis. I thought that was just a tough spot for Arizona State. I thought they get pushed to the limit but still win that ball game. But the detriment and the weakness of this Arizona State team is the rush defense. They're giving up about 180 rushing yards a game, and Oregon State and that offensive line took advantage of that. You saw what they were able to do in terms of pounding Arizona State defensive front. They got a lot of yards between the tackles. Now they have to play a Washington State team that stretches you vertically. The only problem is that Washington State doesn't have a very tough blue-collar rushing attack, more rushing out of the spread. They don't rush for a lot of yards, and I think that's how you have to beat Arizona State. I think it's a tough matchup for Washington State. I think Arizona State wins. They might look a little lackluster and take a couple of quarters to get going, but in the end, I think they get a 10 to 14 point victory at least.
Yeah, and as long as Arizona State and Arizona can hold serve, it sets up an important game when those two rivals meet on the last day of the season as well. And so we turn it over to the Wildcats. They go on the road to Utah, Arizona at 5-2. Rich Rod doing a nice job there with the Wildcats. They've got a better defensive football team than they had last year and going at 7-6. They travel to Utah. The Utes always make it difficult on the road opponent, and the Utes coming off that humbling performance against Oregon when they hung in it going into the fourth quarter at 30-27. Utah losing in blowout fashion from there. They come in at 7-3.
Very interesting matchup because I felt like Utah is built more like Stanford than Stanford is, and they showed that last weekend in the overtime victory where Stanford now is 5-5 on the year. Very disappointing season for David Shaw. But you look at this Utah team, Mark, they lead the NCAA in sacks, 47 sacks through 11 games. Nate Orchard, 16 and a half sacks on the year, leads the NCAAs. He's a dominant player, but their ability to put pressure on opposing offensive lines, you saw what they were able to do against Brett Hundley and contain him on the road. They sacked him 10 times in that matchup. I think this is a very difficult matchup for Arizona. They played very well, and they have a very solid defense as well, but this is a dominant defense up front by Utah. Make no mistake about it, this is one of the best defenses in college football. I think traveling to Utah on the road with a freshman quarterback, now Solomon's played very well up until this point, but they needed a little luck against Washington, who, by the way, has a very solid defensive front themselves, led by nose guard Danny Shelton. They struggled a little bit last week at home against Washington. I expect the same this weekend on the road. I think Utah gets the victory against the Wildcats. Very blue-collar offensive defensive lines, and I think Booker could have a big day against that Wildcat defense.
Yeah, you mentioned Utah coming off that overtime win at Stanford. The Utes, surprisingly, in that one, a 9-point underdog. Maybe some people out there took advantage of that. Arizona, as you mentioned, yeah, when they faced UCLA, which is one of the more physical teams in the Pac-12, we saw a difference in the Wildcats there not being able to hold up at the line of scrimmage. All right, Joe, let's move it out to the Big Ten, because although Ohio State seems to be holding serve to try to get to the college football playoff, and they are the one torchbearer for the Big Ten, this Wisconsin team has suddenly maybe opened some eyes and possibly has Ohio State's attention after that complete drubbing against Nebraska, in which they were down 17-3, scored 56 consecutive points, and we know at this point, unless you live under a rock, if you have any college football information in front of you, it involves Melvin Gordon rushing for an all-time record, 408 yards. Iowa, despite some very dismal performances, most notably 2 weeks ago against Minnesota, giving up 51 points. I never would have thought that an Iowa-Minnesota pick'em game was 51-14, that Iowa, even at 4-2, if they can defeat Wisconsin straight up, then they put themselves back into position to vie for a division championship. So it's the Badgers, a pretty heavy favorite, playing really good football right now, kicking themselves for somehow losing to Northwestern weeks ago and somehow blowing a 24-7 lead with Melvin Gordon on the sideline against LSU earlier this season at Iowa to take on the Hawkeyes.
Interesting matchup, because I really think Iowa could play Wisconsin very tough. You look at Wisconsin overall, dominating performance last week. Melvin Gordon, 408 yards in 3 quarters against what I thought was a solid defensive front in Nebraska, really dominating performance. You looked over at the screen, it was 17-3 Nebraska. Tommy Armstrong was rushing and creating a lot of problems for that Badger defense. Next thing you knew, Melvin Gordon had about 300 yards on the afternoon. So dominating offensive line performance by Wisconsin. But the one thing that I don't like about Wisconsin is that they're -3 in turnover margin and they're -7 in turnover margin on the road. And it's still, if Iowa can shut down Wisconsin's rushing game and force Joel Stalvey to beat them with his arm, I think that's where the problem is. This Iowa team is very erratic. but in my opinion, has the better passing attack with Jake Rudock at the quarterback position, very blue-collar offensive line, and that rushing attack with Weissman, very blue-collar that can pound it out. But if Iowa falls behind, I feel confident that they can come back with Jake Rudock at the quarterback position. I'm not so sure with Joel Stavy in that passing offense. Only 46 passing yards last week. You look at that week 1 performance against LSU, only 50 yards as well. That's the Achilles heel for Wisconsin. Look for Iowa to stuff the box. They're only giving up 147 rushing yards per game and really have a solid defensive front. It's a very interesting matchup. I think Iowa pushes Wisconsin to the limit. I think Wisconsin gets a 3-point victory, though, Mark, 23-20.
This Minnesota team's not bad. They played Ohio State pretty well. The Buckeyes only won by 7. I think they won more handily off the scoreboard. If you really watched the game, the Buckeyes rolled up a ton of offense in that game, committed 3 turnovers. They were going into the end zone a couple times. When they turned it over, could have won that easily by 21 points. Still, Minnesota at home put up a decent effort. The running back Cobb is a powerful, powerful runner that we'll see play on Sunday. Minnesota developing a passing attack that is not going to make anybody forget Marcus Mariota, but at the same time, much better than it was earlier in the season. And again, if somebody can knock off Wisconsin, and most notably, if Minnesota takes care of business this week at Nebraska, they'll get a shot at Wisconsin head-to-head. Then they would have the tiebreaker over the Badgers and could somehow make themselves a candidate to go to the Big Ten championship game. But first things first, Minnesota's got to beat Nebraska. The Huskers hurting after that 56-24 pounding against the Badgers. So we got Minnesota and Nebraska, both teams at 4-2 in the Big Dime.
I like Minnesota in this matchup. I think they can keep it close. You look at their offensive line, really worked over Ohio State in the first half. Cobb got some quality rushing yards between the tackles. They're opportunistic in terms of creating turnovers. They created 2 against Ohio State that led to points. So I like this ball club. And then where is Nebraska going to be in this ball game after coming off just a demoralizing loss to Wisconsin? Everybody mentioned that Big Ten championship game where they put up a 70 spot on them, and after jumping up 17-3 to, like you mentioned, give up 56 unanswered points to Wisconsin. They turned the ball over 5 times, could not get any offense generated in the second half. Minnesota's very solid in passing defense, only giving up about 197 passing yards per game. Very solid senior and junior defense led by Jerry Kill and this defensive staff. I think Minnesota could pull off the upset on Saturday if they could jump up early and put the pressure on Nebraska. Cobb's a very underrated running back. This is a very good spot for Minnesota, in my opinion.
Yeah, Joe, unless I'm missing something here, I can't imagine that Minnesota's an 11-point underdog. I know the game's at Nebraska, and Minnesota's coming off a game that they pretty much put it all out there in regards to effort and trying to pull off the major upset against Ohio State. But I think the Gophers just, again, they are similar to Wisconsin with the talent at running back and a very physical offensive line, and Nebraska has not been able to handle physical running games, not just last week, but the last few years under Bo Pelini, and I think Minnesota's got a real shot to pull off the upset on the road. And finally, shouldn't be much of a game, but we've got to mention Ohio State at home against Indiana as a 34.5-point favorite. Buckeyes at 9-1 have made their way up to number 6 in the polls, trying to get to the college football playoffs, and the Hoosiers just trying to make it to the finish line.
I don't see any way Indiana can win this game. Again, Tevin Coleman had a breakout performance on the road in Piscataway last week, but the defense has really given up a ton of yards in consecutive games to Rutgers, Michigan State. Indiana has not looked good since they were able to get that victory on the road in Columbia week number 3. So this defense is surrendering a lot of yards. You look at Ohio State, I mean, really starting to hit stride later in the season. They're going to need some help in order to get to the playoff, but expect Urban Meyer and that offensive staff to keep pedal to the metal and just unleash J.T. Barrett on this defense. I think this is a dominating Ohio State victory, especially in the horseshoe. I don't see any way Indiana's able to pull off the upset this weekend.
Okay, Joe, let's take one stop in the Big 12 as most of the contenders, well, we've got the one big game on Thursday night, but most of the contenders taking the week off. We've got Oklahoma State taking on Baylor. One of the more disappointing stories in college football in Stillwater. The Cowboys came out against number 1 in week 1 and took the Florida State Seminoles down to the wire, and since then they have been reeling at 3-4 in the conference. Baylor needs to make some statement wins to rise to up from number 7. If they want to make the playoff, they sit at 8-1 and 5-1 in the Big 12.
Well, when you look at Oklahoma State, they've really struggled in terms of ball security. They're -8 in turnover margin on the year, Mark. They started off a very opportunistic defense, but the last few games have not looked good defensively. I think this is a very difficult spot for Oklahoma State. Baylor, like you mentioned, still trailing TCU in the rankings. I think that defense comes to play this weekend, and look for Bryce Petty and Shock Linwood to really open it up against the Cowboy defensive front. I think it's a dominating Baylor performance, especially after last week's performance by TCU on the road in Kansas. Almost got upset. Expect Art Briles and the crew to be up for this ball game. And Mike Gundy, on a side note, being mentioned for the Florida job. What's going on with that? And is the team focused as they take to the road this weekend in Waco? I think Baylor has a dominating victory this weekend.
Okay, Joe, Florida State, in going to the BCS National Championship game last year, pretty much smashed everyone in their path. This road to the Final Four could be much different, has been thus far, even though they're still 10-0 with a 2016 winning streak. A lot of close calls. Now, the one close call to a certain extent that they had last year was surprisingly not against Clemson. It was against Boston College. Eagles led them 17-3. Florida State finally came back, won at 48-34. This team, the BC team, a bit different without Chase Reddick at quarterback, without the great 2,000-yard back Andre Williams now with the New York Giants. But BC looked to have taken a step back this season, acquitting themselves rather well at 6-4 right now with the one marquee win over USC at home. So we've got BC going to Tallahassee to take on Florida State.
Florida State struggle, Mark, with teams that run pro-style offenses this year. Let's look at the two games. Against Miami and Duke Johnson, they gave up a ton of rushing yards off tackle. And against Louisville on the road with Michael Dyer, the same type of offense, really struggled in run support. You look at this BC offensive line, very, very heavy and able to rush the football. They rushed for over 400 yards and almost put up 500 yards of total offense on USC's defense in Chestnut Hill. So I think BC has the type of offensive line to really get some yards against Florida State. The only question I have, whether they can pull off the upset or not, is their secondary. Their secondary doesn't match up very well against Rashad Green and Nick O'Leary at the tight end position. Virginia had the same type of game plan, could keep it close. The only difference between Virginia and BC, in my opinion, Virginia has a much better defense than BC at this point in the season. You saw Louisville challenge BC vertically. I think it's the same type of setup for Florida State. I think Florida State gets the victory. I think they get it by more than 20 points, which is what the experts think, just because of the secondary by Boston College. I think this is a dominating Florida State victory. I think Jameis Winston and that offense look to start fast this weekend and take off where they left off in Miami this coming weekend in Doak Campbell Stadium this weekend.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. The talent disparity is great, but Steve Adazio will definitely have his team ready to play in Tallahassee. So if BC can somehow muster up some turnovers and some big plays, they could stay in it because they won't make mistakes. But the talent, the speed difference is huge. All right, as we mentioned off the top, the SEC basically taking a bye week, the likes of Western Carolina, Eastern Kentucky, Samford, and even Mississippi State taking on Vandy. I believe we're on the same page with Mississippi State coasting home to a victory to get ready for the Egg Bowl. But we do highlight these two games. Ole Miss a bit off the radar after those two tough losses against LSU and against Auburn in Oxford. Still a top 10 team at number 8. So we talked about UCLA possibly playing themselves in. I know it sounds wild with 2 losses, but Ole Miss has a chance to make something happen. They would need a lot of help out there, but they come in at 8-2, and they have to travel to Arkansas. We'll see how the Hogs react after finally breaking through in the SEC after 16 consecutive losses. They beat what was then a top 20 LSU team, so the Hogs are 5-5, hosting the Rebels.
I like Ole Miss in this matchup because I think in order to beat the Ole Miss Rebels, you have to challenge their secondary vertically. I don't think Ole Miss is going to give up a ton of rushing yards to Arkansas the way LSU was able to get rushing success against Ole Miss on the road. I don't think it'll happen with Arkansas. Could be wrong, but in order to beat Ole Miss, you really have to challenge their secondary, and I don't think Brandon Allen's the guy to do it. You look at this offense led by Bo Wallace without Treadwell on the outside. That's going to make a difference. They're going to have to rush the football against Arkansas, but I still think Ole Miss is the much better team on the offense and defensive lines. Kandichi is solid in terms of clogging those holes. I think they'll force Arkansas into third down and long situations, and I think that's where the problem lies if you're a Razorback fan, the inability for Brandon Allen to stretch that defense. I think that's where Ole Miss has the advantage, and I think Ole Miss gets a solid road victory this weekend.
Okay, Joe, our final stops in Knoxville, Tennessee and Missouri. Not a glamorous matchup, but out of all these games, this quite possibly could affect the college football playoff more than any other game. Georgia, most people would consider them to be the biggest threat to the SEC Western Division winner, the most talented team in the East, that on one of their good days, not one of their off days, but one of their good days, could beat a Western Division team. Most people don't think Mizzou has the horses to handle a winner of the SEC West, most notably Alabama. But Mizzou, if they beat Tennessee and they beat Arkansas, will represent the East at 7-1. They go to Tennessee to take on the Vols.
Interesting matchup. It's back-to-back road games for Missouri. I think that'll have a factor on this team. But let's be honest, Tennessee will be without their starting middle linebacker and leading tackler, A.J. Johnson, who was suspended. So from a defensive perspective, how will the Volunteers step up? But it's the offense led by Joshua Dobbs, Mark, in back-to-back games against Kentucky and South Carolina. Dobbs has led that offense to over 500 total yards in both of those games. You look at his performance last week against Kentucky, 297 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, no INTs. He added another 48 yards on the ground and a touchdown run. The offensive line playing very, very well for Tennessee. I think that's the difference. And you look at Missouri's 2 losses on the year, to Georgia and to Indiana, both run-heavy offenses. You look at Georgia, more of a pro-style offense with that heavy offensive line. Indiana has a very run-heavy offense that runs out of the spread, and that defensive front had big problems in run support. Tennessee likes to run the football with Dobbs as well, playing at home. I think that's the advantage, even without A.J. Johnson. Couple the fact that Missouri's playing with a lot of pressure. They have to win out. Back-to-back road games. I think that's the difference. Tennessee gets the victory this weekend over Missouri, but it's close. I think it's a 7-point victory, 27-20. Volunteers win.
Tennessee at 5-5 needs one more win to become postseason eligible. They've got Vanderbilt to finish off the season. They'll be a huge favorite in that one. But Vols fans would finally love to see a winning team playing postseason play at 7-5, and they can do that with a win over Mizzou. And who would have thought a couple years ago when Texas A&M and Missouri joined the SEC that the Mizzou Tigers could represent the SEC Eastern Division 2 of their first 3 years in the league? That's pretty surprising, Joe.
Incredible, Mark. It is very incredible when you think about it. And if you're a Georgia Bulldog fan, you'll be sporting orange on Saturday night as the Volunteers take to the field in Neyland Stadium, because Georgia needs some help, like you mentioned. And it's incredible what Gary Pinkel was able to do. He was almost on his way out 2 years ago. after that team really not performing well, almost had him on the chopping block, but he was able to turn it around last year with a very under-the-radar team led by James Franklin and Matty Mock coming in when Franklin got hurt. This year he loses two of his big play wide receivers in LaDainian Washington and Dorial Green-Beckham, and he still has that team at 7-2. You have to credit Gary Pinkel for doing an absolute incredible job with the talent that he has in Columbia.
Yeah, along with two NFL defensive ends out the door and his best cornerback, who's also playing in the National Football League, E.J. Gaines. Joe Lisi of @GoForThe2.com laying down the knowledge for us each and every week on Tuesday night. Catch us on Google Hangouts right here, or the podcast, or the video on YouTube, or at MarkRogersTV.com. Hey, Joe, appreciate the time, man.
Always a pleasure, Mark. Love the show. Can't wait for the weekend.